October 21st, 1944. The ancient city of Aachen, the first major German city to face the wrath of the Allied ground invasion. The air does not smell of autumn. It smells of pulverized brick, wet ash, and the copper tang of old blood. Inside the damp, trembling cellar of a commandeered cathedral annex, the world has shrunk to the flicker of a single kerosene lamp and the rhythmic, terrifying thud of artillery walking closer. Here, amidst the groan of wounded men and the sifting dust falling from the cracked ceiling, a group of women in the starch-white but blood-stained uniforms of the German Red Cross, the Schwestern, wait for the end. They do not speak. They do not pray. They simply listen to the grinding of gears outside, the metallic screech of tank treads that do not sound like the panzers they grew up idolizing. These are heavier, louder, and there are so many of them that the ground itself seems to be vibrating in a constant state of earthquake. For these women, particularly the younger nurses who have known nothing but the Third Reich, this is not merely the end of a battle, it is the end of their universe. They are terrified not just of death, but of what they have been told lies beyond it. To understand the sheer, paralyzing terror gripping these nurses in the cellar of Aachen, one must look backward, away from the front lines and into the radio speakers of every German home. For years, Joseph Goebbels and the propaganda machine of the Reich had spun a very specific, very horrifying narrative about the Americans. They were not portrayed merely as soldiers of an opposing nation. They were depicted as gangsters of Chicago, a mongrel horde of undisciplined, culturally void barbarians who would loot, burn, and violate anything in their path. The German people had been warned repeatedly that an American victory meant the annihilation of German culture and the brutalization of German women. The nurses in Aachen had absorbed this fear into their marrow. They believed with the certainty of gravity that capture meant assault, followed by execution. As the firing outside the cellar intensifies and then suddenly, chillingly, stops, the silence that follows is heavier than the shelling. They hear boots on the cobblestones above, heavy, confident boots, voices speaking a language that sounds flat and harsh to their ears. The wooden door at the top of the cellar stairs creaks open, letting in a shaft of gray daylight and the swirling dust of the ruined city. The nurses huddle closer to the wounded soldiers on the stretchers, instinctively trying to shield the broken men with their own bodies, waiting for the violence they were promised. A silhouette appears at the top of the stairs. It is an American GI, his helmet netting distinct against the light, an M1 Garand rifle held loosely in one hand. He descends slowly, his eyes scanning the gloom. He is not the screaming barbarian they expected. He looks tired. He looks covered in grime. He looks incredibly young. The head nurse, a woman in her 40s named Elfriede, braces herself, her hands trembling so violently she has to clasp them together against her apron. She waits for the shout, the gunshot, the aggression. Instead, the American soldier reaches into the deep pocket of his olive drab field jacket. The nurses flinch, expecting a grenade, but the hand emerges holding something small, rectangular, and wrapped in brown wax paper. He tosses it gently onto the cot of the nearest wounded German soldier. It is not a weapon, it is a D-ration bar, a block of concentrated chocolate. This moment, this microscopic interaction in the Grand Theater of the Second World War, represents a collision of realities that is far more damaging to the Nazi ideology than any artillery shell. The soldier gestures to the nurses, motions to his mouth, and says something unintelligible but clearly not threatening. Then more Americans descend. They do not drag the women away. They do not execute the wounded. They begin to move among the stretchers, checking bandages, offering cigarettes, and most shockingly, opening their packs. This is the moment the psychological dam breaks. It is the moment where the gangster narrative dissolves in the face of the overwhelming, undeniable reality of American logistics. What the German nurses encounter in the hours that follow is a shock to the system that historians often overlook in favor of tank battles and air raids. It is the shock of abundance. To the German mind in 1944, food was a weapon, a currency, and a scarcity. The Reich had been starving by degrees since 1942. The ersatz culture had taken over, bread made with sawdust extenders, coffee made from roasted acorns, meat that was barely recognizable as muscle. Rationing was strict, lethal, and omnipresent. A German soldier on the Eastern Front might be lucky to receive a hunk of moldy bread and a tin of watery soup. But here, in this cellar, the Americans are casual, almost careless, with commodities that would buy a king's ransom on the black market in Berlin. The medics bring in crates, not just ammunition, but food. The primary instrument of this psychological devastation is the K-Ration. To the American GI, the K-Ration was often a source of complaint, monotonous, constipating, and bland. But to the German nurses and the starving POWs they tended, the K-Ration was a miracle of engineering and wealth. As the American medics set up a triage station alongside the German staff, they begin to share their lunch. They crack open the small tins with the erratic little keys attached to the bottom. The smell that wafts through the cellar is distinct, oily, and rich. processed pork, egg yolks, cheese. It smells of calories. It smells of a nation that has not only solved the problem of production, but has mastered the art of preservation and transport across an entire ocean. One nurse, a young woman named Ilsa, recounts being handed a tin of biscuits and a packet of soluble coffee. She stares at the packet. In Germany, real coffee is a memory, a ghost of the pre-war years. She watches as an American medic heats water in his canteen cup over a small chemical tablet. Another marvel of technology, and mixes the powder. The aroma is intoxicating. When she tastes it, hot and strong and sweet with the sugar he generously poured in, she begins to weep. Not out of fear, but out of a sudden, crushing realization of the lie she has lived. The propaganda had told her the Americans were weak, degenerate, and crumbling. Yet here they were, thousands of miles from home, carrying the comforts of a cafe in their pockets. If they could bring hot coffee and chocolate to the front lines of Aachen, what couldn't they do? How could Germany, scavenging for potatoes and horse meat, possibly hope to defeat a nation that wrapped its soldiers in wool and fed them meat 3 times a day? This realization is the true turning point. It is the ice cream ship phenomenon writ small. There's a famous anecdote from the Pacific Theater where Japanese commanders realized the war was lost when they learned the US Navy had dedicated barges solely to manufacturing ice cream for the troops. In the cellar at Aachen, the German nurses experience a similar epiphany. The sheer volume of material is overwhelming. The Americans have ample bandages. They have penicillin, a wonder drug that the Germans have in such short supply it is reserved only for the highest-ranking officers. Here, the American medics are dusting the wounds of captured German privates with sulfa powder as if it were sand. The generosity is confusing, disarming, and ultimately humiliating. It strips away the martyrdom the Nazis tried to instill. It is hard to feel like a glorious defender of the fatherland when the enemy is feeding you better than your own government did. The interaction shifts from a tense standoff to a strange, cooperative, humanitarian effort. The German nurses, trained to be stoic and hard, find themselves softening. They watch the Americans interact with each other. There is a looseness to them, a lack of the rigid, spine-snapping discipline of the Wehrmacht. They chew gum, a constant rhythmic motion that fascinates the Germans. They lean against walls. They joke. But when they work, they are efficient, fast, and skilled. The nurses realize that the barbarian narrative was a projection. These men are not gangsters. They are factory workers, farmers, and clerks, backed by the greatest industrial supply chain in human history. As the day turns to night, the shelling outside resumes, but inside, the atmosphere has transformed. The terror of capture has been replaced by a quiet, full-bellied bewilderment. The nurses eat the rest of the rations given to them. Tins of stew, crackers, hard candy. They taste the salt and the fat, nutrients their bodies have been screaming for. The food does something physiological. It clears the fog of starvation. It allows them to think. And in that clarity, the ideology of the Reich begins to fracture. They look at the young Americans, some of whom are now sleeping in the corners, indifferent to the dangerous enemy women nearby, and they see the truth of the war. They see that Germany has been fighting a mathematical impossibility. This dynamic was repeated across the Western Front as the Allies pushed into Germany. The fraternization ban was technically in effect. Americans were told not to interact with Germans, and Germans were terrified of Americans. But the reality of human need and American abundance constantly eroded these barriers. The chocolate bar, the cigarette, the tin of Spam, these were the ambassadors of democracy. They communicated a message that no pamphlet could convey. We have so much, we can afford to keep you alive. It was a power move, a flex of logistical superiority disguised as charity. For the German nurses, who had been prepared to bite down on cyanide capsules or fight with scalpels, the reality of chewing on a piece of American chocolate was a shock so profound it often left them in a state of stunned docility. The symbolism of the ration pack in this context cannot be overstated. It was the physical embodiment of the American spirit, mass-produced, standardized, democratic, and effective. Every soldier got the same ration, from the general to the private. In the hierarchical, status-obsessed world of the Nazi military, this equality was alien. The nurses watched as officers and men ate the same food, often sitting together. It was a subtle dismantling of the worldview they had been indoctrinated into. The master race was starving and rigid. The mongrel hordes were well-fed, relaxed, and winning. By the time the trucks arrived to transport the prisoners to the rear, the nurses of Aachen are different women. They climb into the back of the deuce-and-a-half trucks, not with the trembling terror of cattle going to slaughter, but with a weary resignation mixed with relief. They are leaving the war. They are going to camps where they now suspect there will be more food, more coffee, and no bombs. As the truck pulls away, rattling over the cobblestones, one of the nurses might look back at the ruins of the city. The blackened skeleton of the cathedral, the crushed homes, the smoke rising in pillars to join the low clouds. She clutches the empty wrapper of the chocolate bar in her pocket, a talisman of the new world that is coming. In the end, the conquest of Germany was not just achieved through the violence of the M4 Sherman tank or the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was achieved through the crushing weight of the supply chain. It was won by the sheer, undeniable reality of a nation that could shower its enemies with calories while the other side could barely feed its own children. The terror those nurses felt in the opening moments was real, born of lies and isolation. But the relief they felt, the taste of sugar and fat on their tongues, was the taste of truth. It was the realization that the monster they feared was actually a liberator, not because of ideology, but because he brought with him the one thing the Reich could no longer provide. A future. The war would drag on for months, but in that cellar, in the hearts of those women, the Reich had already fallen, defeated not by a bullet, but by a gesture of kindness and a tin of meat.